Around 70,000 years ago, something mysterious and extraordinary happened to our species. Before this turning point, Homo sapiens were just one of several human groups scattered across Africa, eking out a living with simple stone tools, hunting small animals, and foraging for roots and berries. They were clever, yes, but not remarkably more so than the Neanderthals in Europe or the Denisovans in Asia. For over 100,000 years, their existence was fragile and often unremarkable, a survival story that blended into the larger drama of nature. And yet, within a relatively short span of time, after 70,000 BCE, something shifted. Humans began to behave in new ways that would set them apart permanently from every other living creature on Earth. The archaeological record shows tantalizing clues. In the centuries after 70,000 BCE, caves in Africa and Europe suddenly display abstract art, etched patterns, beads made from shells, pigments carefully prepared for body painting. Tools became more sophisticated, specialized, and diverse. Evidence of long-distance trade appears, suggesting that groups of Homo sapiens were communicating across wide territories. Burial sites hint at rituals, respect for the dead, and even a glimpse of spiritual thought. This was not simply survival anymore. It was culture. It was imagination. It was the birth of the modern human mind. Scholars have called this sudden flowering of creativity and complexity the cognitive revolution. But why did it happen? What changed in Homo sapiens around 70,000 BCE that never occurred in Neanderthals or other humans? Theories abound, and none are yet proven with absolute certainty. Some suggest it was a genetic mutation, a small change in brain wiring that unlocked new capacities for symbolic thought and complex language. Others point to social pressures. As human groups grew larger, cooperation required new forms of communication, storytelling, and shared myth-making. Still others argue it was not one single event, but a convergence of climate challenges, migrations, and gradual accumulations of skills that suddenly tipped into a transformation. The puzzle of 70,000 BCE matters because it was here that humanity as we know it was born. Every novel, every religion, every political system, every piece of art, every scientific theory, all trace their roots back to this leap. Without it, Homo sapiens might have remained one clever primate among many, destined to vanish like the Neanderthals, leaving only a trace in fossil beds. Instead, we became the species that reshaped the planet, for better and worse. To understand the magnitude of this turning point, we must look both backward and forward. Backward to see what life was like before this revolution, when humans lived much like other animals, adapting but not dominating. Forward to trace the cascading consequences that followed migrations out of Africa. Encounters with rival humans, extinctions of other species, and eventually, the first steps toward civilization. The story of 70,000 BCE is not just about archaeology or genetics. It is about the very essence of what makes us human: imagination, cooperation, and the ability to build worlds in our minds before shaping them with our hands. And so we begin our journey. Over the next chapters, we will travel through deep prehistory, examining the fragile survival of our ancestors, the mysteries of language and symbolism, the drama of encountering other human species, and the breakthroughs that made our species unique. Each section will bring us closer to answering the central question: what changed humanity forever around 70,000 BCE? To truly understand the magnitude of what occurred around 70,000 BCE, we must first imagine the world of Homo sapiens before the transformation. Picture Africa roughly 100,000 years ago. It was not the barren savanna we often imagine, but a land of shifting climates, alternating between lush greenery and arid droughts. With animals, we recognize lions, elephants, giraffes, and others now lost to time, like giant buffalo or saber-toothed cats. Into this environment moved small groups of Homo sapiens, fragile and vulnerable, living lives that were dangerous, short, and often indistinguishable from those of other large mammals. These humans did not yet dominate their environment. They were not the lords of the earth that later myths and histories would proclaim. Instead, they were prey as much as predator, competing with hyenas for scraps of carcasses, watching nervously for leopards at night, wary of snakes underfoot and crocodiles at the riverbank. Their most reliable weapons were simple stone tools, flaked into sharp edges, but crude compared to what would come later. They could cut meat, scrape hides, break bones from marrow, but they lacked the sophisticated spears, bows, and traps that future generations would master. Hunting was dangerous and often unsuccessful. More often, survival meant scavenging and gathering roots, nuts, berries, small game, and the occasional large animal carcass abandoned by lions. Their social world was equally simple. Anthropologists estimate that early human bands rarely exceeded a few dozen individuals, perhaps 20 to 50 at most. Within these groups, life was intensely communal. Everyone knew everyone else. There were no strangers, no outsiders. Survival required cooperation. One man's hunt could feed the entire band. One woman's knowledge of edible plants could mean the difference between life and starvation. But beyond these small circles, trust was rare. Two groups, meeting by chance, were just as likely to fight over territory as to share information. Unlike later humans, these early sapiens lacked the tools of myth, language, or culture that could bind hundreds or thousands of people together. Their loyalty ended where their band ended. It is striking to realize how unremarkable Homo sapiens were at this time. They coexisted with other human species, Neanderthals in Europe and the Near East, Denisovans in Asia, perhaps even remnant groups of Homo erectus in far-flung islands. And in many respects, those other humans seemed superior. Neanderthals, for example, had stronger builds, sturdier bones, and brains just as large as ours, in some cases larger. Archaeological evidence suggests they were skilled hunters, capable of bringing down massive prey like mammoths. Denisovans, though less well understood, left genetic traces in modern populations, evidence that they too were successful and adapted to harsh environments. By comparison, sapiens were fragile, thinner-boned, and on the surface, no more remarkable than any of their cousins. So what kept them alive? Flexibility. Even before the great turning point, Homo sapiens had a unique ability to adapt to changing environments. While Neanderthals were specialized for cold climates, sapiens thrived in warmer, more variable landscapes. They could shift from hunting to gathering, from plains to forests, from coastlines to mountains. This flexibility, though subtle, laid the groundwork for what was to come. But for now, before 70,000 BCE, their existence was precarious. Infant mortality was high. Death from predators or infections was common. Life expectancy at birth may have been less than 30 years. And, crucially, there is little evidence of art, symbolism, or abstract thought. Caves from this period are bare, with no signs of painting or carving. Graves, when they exist at all, are simple and without ritual. It was as though humanity had not yet discovered its soul, and yet, beneath the surface, the potential was there. The brain of Homo sapiens was already large, already complex, already capable of imagination. What was missing was a spark, a change in how the brain was used, how thoughts were shared, how groups organized themselves. The seeds of language were present, though not yet in full bloom. The capacity for art was there, though not yet. Expressed the ability to invent myths, to believe in invisible things, to cooperate with strangers through shared stories, all slept within the human mind, waiting for the trigger, before the turning point. Then Homo sapiens lived on the edge of greatness, but did not yet know it. They were animals among animals, clever but not extraordinary, surviving day to day in small, scattered bands. That would only change after the mysterious events of 70,000 BCE, when something unlocked the full potential of their minds. This is the stage on which the drama begins. A fragile species, one misstep away from extinction, yet holding within their skulls the most powerful tool evolution had ever produced. Story depends on how that tool was finally unleashed. To grasp the scale of what happened around 70,000 BCE, we need to picture the world in which Homo sapiens lived. This was not our modern Earth, with its neat borders and familiar climates. It was a planet in flux, dominated by ice, shifting ecosystems, and a delicate balance of species. The Earth of 70,000 years ago was colder, wilder, and more dangerous than anything we know today. It was a world that tested human survival every single day at that time. Much of the northern hemisphere was locked in the grip of the Ice Age. Vast glaciers spread over Europe, North America, and parts of Asia, carving the land with their slow advance. Where today there are fertile plains and cities, there were endless sheets of ice, hundreds of meters thick. The climate was unstable, swinging between warmer interludes and brutal freezes. Even in Africa, the homeland of sapiens, conditions were far from stable. Periods of drought could shrink lakes and rivers, turning green valleys into barren dust bowls. Then, suddenly, rains would return, flooding the land with life. These cycles forced early humans to adapt quickly or perish. The animals that roamed this world were both familiar and strange. In Africa, sapiens shared the land with lions, elephants, hippos, and giraffes, species still recognizable today. but also with now extinct giants. Enormous buffalo, with horns wider than a man, was tall, massive antelopes, and saber-toothed cats that prowled the savannas. In Europe and Asia, mammoths grazed in great herds. Woolly rhinoceroses lumbered across the tundra, and giant deer with antlers spanning over 3 meters roamed the forests. Australia, which sapiens had not yet reached, was a land of giant marsupials, towering birds, and predatory reptiles. South America, still untouched by humans, teemed with giant sloths, armored glyptodons, and terrifying flightless birds. The planet was rich in megafauna, large animals that would later vanish after humans spread across the globe. It is important to remember that Homo sapiens were not alone among humans. The world was shared with other members of our genus, each adapted to their own environments. The Neanderthals, sturdy and intelligent, occupied Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans, a shadowy cousin known mostly from DNA, inhabited parts of Central and Eastern Asia. Farther east, remnants of Homo erectus may have still survived on isolated islands, descendants of the first humans to leave Africa nearly 2 million years earlier. There's even evidence of small-bodied humans, Homo Floresiensis, sometimes called the hobbits, living on the Indonesian island of Flores. Humanity was not yet one species, but many, a scattered family of cousins. From the outside, there was nothing inevitable about Homo sapiens rising above the rest. In fact, given their fragile build and limited tools, they might have seemed the least likely to survive. Predators posed a constant threat. Crocodiles stalked river crossings, hyenas and lions prowled at night, and leopards were skilled at ambushing. The unwary, for a lone human or even a small group, the wilderness was filled with danger. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Protection came only through cooperation, fire, and the vigilance of the group. At night, campfires glowed not just for warmth or cooking, but as circles of safety in a dark world filled with glowing eyes. Fire was the thin line between survival and death, a fragile defense that had to be maintained constantly. The environment also forced humans into constant movement. Water sources dried up, herds migrated, and plant foods were seasonal. Nomadism was not a choice. It was a necessity. Camps were temporary, built from branches, hides, and whatever materials were at hand, then abandoned when resources were exhausted. In this sense, Homo sapiens were not masters of their environment, but followers of its rhythms. Drifting where food and water led them, stability, villages, or permanent settlements were unthinkable. The idea of home was the campfire, not a place. Yet even within this harsh and shifting world, there were advantages waiting to be exploited. The diversity of environments meant opportunities for those who could learn quickly and share knowledge. Rivers provided fish and shellfish. Forests offered fruits and roots. Grasslands supported herds of game. Groups that could adapt to all three had more chances to survive. This ecological flexibility was one of sapiens' hidden strengths. Unlike the Neanderthals, who were specialized for the cold and for big game hunting, sapiens could thrive in multiple landscapes. They might not have been the strongest hunters, but they were the most versatile. The world around Homo sapiens, then, was both threat and opportunity. It was a world of abundance and scarcity, beauty and terror, challenge and possibility. It was a stage crowded, not only with animals, but with rival humans, each species struggling for survival. And it was precisely this crucible of shifting climates, predators, and competition that set the conditions for the great leap forward. Without the pressures of this dangerous environment, perhaps the spark of the cognitive revolution would never have been lit. For now, though, in the centuries before 70,000 BCE, the world was indifferent to humanity. Retreated, the rivers swelled and dried. The mammoths grazed, the lions hunted, the winds blew across empty plains. Homo sapiens were merely one fragile species among many, unremarkable in the eyes of nature. The revolution had not yet begun. The stage was set, but the play had not started. When we imagine the world of 70,000 BCE, it is tempting to think of Homo sapiens as standing alone on the stage of history. But this was not the case. For tens of thousands of years, our species shared the world with others, cousins who were not just similar to us, but in many ways more impressive. Chief among them were the Neanderthals of Europe and Western Asia, and the Denisovans of the East. They were not monsters, not primitive caricatures, but fully human in their own right, with brains, tools, families, and cultures. For sapiens, they were both rivals and kin. The Neanderthals had been thriving in Europe long before sapiens even left Africa. Stocky, muscular, and well adapted to the cold. They were a product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in glacial environments. Their bodies were powerfully built, with broad chests, thick bones, and strong limbs, perfect for enduring harsh winters and for the physical demands of close-range hunting. Their skulls were slightly different in shape from ours, with heavy brow ridges and broader noses. But inside those skulls sat brains as large as, and sometimes larger than, our own. If intelligence is measured by brain size alone, Neanderthals were our equals. Their toolkits were sophisticated, though different from ours. They crafted Maustrian tools, carefully shaped stone flakes, scrapers, and points used for cutting hides, processing meat, and hunting. Unlike earlier humans, they were skilled in working with fire, using it to cook food and harden wooden spear tips. They lived in small groups, built shelters from animal hides, and often used caves for protection. Archaeologists have found evidence that Neanderthals buried their dead, sometimes with flowers or tools, suggesting they had rituals, emotions, and perhaps even a sense of the sacred. Far from being brutish cavemen, they were thoughtful beings, capable of empathy and care. The Denisovans, though more mysterious, were no less significant. Known today almost entirely through DNA and a few fossil fragments discovered in Siberia. They occupied vast swaths of Asia. Their genetic legacy lives on in modern populations. People in Melanesia, Australia, and parts of East Asia still carry Denisovan DNA, proof of ancient encounters. What little we know suggests they too were skilled toolmakers, hunters, and survivors of harsh climates. their ability to adapt to high altitudes, encoded in genes still present in Tibetans today, hints at a remarkable resilience. Like Neanderthals, they were not relics of the past, but fully capable humans, living lives as rich and complex as any sapiens band, to sapiens encountering them for the first time. These other humans must have been both familiar and strange. A Neanderthal looked enough like us to be recognizable as kin, yet different enough to spark curiosity, caution, or fear. Counters were likely tense, shaped by the competition for food, water, and shelter. But they were not always hostile. The genetic record shows that sapiens and Neanderthals interbred, as did sapiens and Denisovans. These were not separate stories, but intertwined destinies. To this day, every person of non-African descent carries about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, a living reminder of ancient intimacy. Some populations also carry Denisovan DNA, particularly those from Oceania, whose ancestors mixed with these cousins tens of thousands of years ago. If Neanderthals and Denisovans were so capable, why did they vanish while sapiens endured? The answer is complex and debated. Some scientists argue that Homo sapiens simply outcompeted them, using superior tools, language, and cooperation to dominate resources. Others suggest climate played a decisive role as Ice Age conditions shifted. Fragile populations of Neanderthals dwindled, unable to adapt as flexibly as sapiens. Another theory is that their smaller group sizes and isolation left them vulnerable. Sapiens, through wider networks of exchange and communication, could gather allies and information across greater distances. Whatever the cause, by 30,000 years ago, both Neanderthals and Denisovans had disappeared, leaving sapiens the sole survivors. Yet it would be a mistake to view them as failures. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals thrived in some of the harshest environments on Earth. They survived ice ages, hunted massive animals, and cared for their young and elderly. Denisovans adapted to high mountains and remote forests, carving out niches sapiens had not yet dreamed of. If not for the peculiar events of 70,000 BCE, the turning point that unlocked the unique capacities of our species, history might have been different. Perhaps it would be Neanderthals, making documentaries about their strange, extinct cousins, the sapiens. Evolution does not follow a script. The dominance of our species was never guaranteed. The existence of these competitors also highlights how unusual the present is. Today, Homo sapiens are alone. We walk the earth without cousins, without rivals, without any other humans to remind us we were once part of a larger family. But 70,000 years ago, the world was crowded with humanity, in many forms. It was a contest of survival, a test of adaptation, and only one branch would ultimately endure. When we speak of the turning point at 70,000 BCE, then we must remember it was not just a transformation within sapiens. It was a shift that determined the fate of all humanity. Our cognitive leap did not simply elevate us, it sealed the destiny of our cousins. The rise of imagination, language, and shared myths gave sapiens an edge that Neanderthals and Denisovans could not match. And so, one by one, they faded into memory, leaving only bones, tools, and fragments of DNA, shadows of a time when we were not alone. Long before the dramatic leap at 70,000 BCE, humans had already begun to shape their world with tools and fire. These two inventions, simple on the surface, yet profound in their implications, laid the foundations for everything that would follow. They were not unique to Homo sapiens, for Neanderthals, and even earlier species like Homo erectus also wielded them. Yet in the hands of sapiens, tools and fire would become instruments not just of survival, but of transformation. To understand the turning point, we must first explore the ancient roots of human ingenuity. The story of tools stretches back nearly 3 million years. Long before sapiens appeared, our distant ancestors in Africa began striking stones together, creating sharp flakes that could cut meat, break bones, and scrape hides. This was the dawn of the old Dowan industry, the earliest known stone tools. Over time, techniques grew more sophisticated. By 1.7 million years ago, Homo erectus had mastered the Aquiline hand axe, a teardrop-shaped stone tool carefully chipped on both sides to create a razor edge. These tools reveal something profound: planning. To shape a hand axe required imagining the finished form, striking at precise angles, and discarding mistakes. The mental leap was small compared to modern engineering, but immense compared to the unthinking behavior of other animals. By the time Homo sapiens emerged around 300,000 years ago, toolmaking was a deeply ingrained tradition. Early sapiens inherited a world where stone, bone, and wood could be fashioned into weapons and utensils. Their earliest tools were simple scrapers, points, and cutters, little different from those of Neanderthals. But even before the Great Revolution, hints of creativity appeared. In South Africa's Blombos Cave, artifacts dated to about 100,000 years ago include not just functional tools, but engraved ochre pieces, decorated with crosshatch patterns. These marks may not have been art in the modern sense, but they suggest that tools were beginning to carry symbolic meaning, not just practical use. Fire was the other crucial inheritance. Evidence shows that humans controlled fire at least 1 million years ago, perhaps even earlier. For Homo erectus, fire meant cooked food, which was easier to digest and more nutritious, fueling the growth of bigger brains. For Neanderthals, fire meant warmth in glacial Europe, protection against predators, and the ability to settle in caves through long winters. By the time of early sapiens, fire was central to daily life. Hearths appear at archaeological sites across Africa and the Middle East, circles of ash and charcoal, where groups gathered for warmth, cooking, and storytelling. Around the fire, humans were not just animals surviving the night. They were communities, sharing food and memory. The combination of tools and fire changed the very biology of our species. Cooked meat provided more calories, freeing energy for brain development. Tools expanded the range of foods humans could access: bone marrow, roots, shellfish, and eventually large animals. The hand and the brain co-evolved, each pushing the other to greater dexterity. A sharper flake meant a cleaner cut. A better spear meant a safer hunt. A controlled fire meant a longer life. These were incremental changes, accumulating over millennia, but they set the stage for something more dramatic, without the mastery of tools and fire. The cognitive leap at 70,000 BCE would have had no foundation. And yet, compared to what came later, these early tools and fires were limited. A Neanderthal spear was thrust at close range, requiring immense strength and courage. A hand axe was versatile, but crude compared to the specialized blades and needles of later humans. Fire was kept alive by carrying embers from camp to camp, not yet created at will with sparks and tinder. These limitations mattered. They meant that before 70,000 BCE, human groups were still vulnerable, still dependent on nature's rhythms. Tools gave them an edge, but not dominance. Fire gave them protection, but not security. What distinguishes Homo sapiens after the turning point is not that they used tools and fire, but how they began to innovate and imagine with them. After 70,000 BCE, we find blades so fine they could cut like scalpels, bone needles for sewing clothes, composite weapons combining stone, wood, and sinew, and evidence of fire used not just for cooking, but for altering landscapes. This was the leap from survival technology to culture-bearing technology. But before that leap, tools and fire were the quiet companions of humanity, shaping the way we lived, ate, and dreamed. It is striking to think that every great human achievement, the pyramids of Egypt, the ships of exploration, the rockets to the moon, rests on these humble beginnings. The first sparks struck from stone, the first hand axe chipped from a river pebble, the first fire tended through a long cold night. These were the ancestors of all invention. They were the groundwork of civilization, even if the people who used them could not imagine what lay ahead. In the end, the story of tools and fire before 70,000 BCE is one of preparation. Humanity had the raw materials, the inherited traditions, the basic skills. What they lacked was the cognitive spark, the explosion of imagination and communication that would transform these tools into instruments of power. The fire was lit, but it was not yet ablaze. The stone was sharp, but it was not yet a scalpel. The world waited for the moment when tools and fire would be joined by something far greater, the human mind in full bloom. Somewhere around 70,000 years ago, something happened in the minds of Homo sapiens, something so profound that scholars today call it the cognitive revolution. It was not the invention of a tool or the discovery of fire, both of which had existed for hundreds of thousands of years. It was not the sudden arrival of new muscles or sharper teeth, for sapiens were already physically much as we are today. Instead, it was an invisible shift, a change in the wiring of the brain, in the way thoughts were formed, shared, and imagined. This revolution did not leave behind fossilized bones or obvious artifacts at first, but its echoes can be seen everywhere. In what followed, art, religion, language, cooperation, migration, and ultimately civilization. The basic idea of the cognitive revolution is simple but radical, that at some point Homo sapiens began to think differently. Before our ancestors could survive with simple tools, small bands, and basic communication. Afterward, they began to create stories, myths, symbols, and shared beliefs that bound strangers together in larger communities. They began to imagine things that did not exist in the physical world. Spirits, gods, laws, nations, money, and treat them as real. No other species has ever done this. Not even our closest cousins, the Neanderthals. The ability to believe in fictions may sound trivial, but it was the decisive edge that allowed sapiens to rise above all other humans and all other animals. But what caused this shift? Scholars debate fiercely. Some suggest a genetic mutation changed the structure of the brain, unlocking new capacities for symbolic thought and complex grammar. Others argue it was cultural rather than biological, that small innovations in language, tool-making, or social rituals accumulated until they tipped into something qualitatively new. Perhaps it was environmental pressure, as climate swings forced groups to cooperate more closely and innovate faster. Or perhaps it was not a single cause at all, but a convergence, the right brain, the right challenges, the right opportunities, all colliding at once. Whatever its origin, the evidence of the revolution is unmistakable. After 70,000 BCE, the archaeological record transforms. In caves across Africa and Eurasia, we see paintings of animals, abstract shapes, and even handprints, marks of imagination made permanent on stone. We find beads carved from shells, ochre pigments prepared for body decoration, and figurines that seem to represent not just real creatures, but mythical hybrids. Tools become more sophisticated and specialized: blades, needles, fishing hooks. Graves begin to show signs of ritual, as if the dead were being sent on a journey, not simply discarded. These are not the behaviors of clever animals. They are the behaviors of minds that dream, that ask questions, that tell stories. The cognitive revolution also reshaped society. Before, humans lived in small bands of a few dozen, bound by personal trust. Afterward, sapiens could cooperate in groups of hundreds, even thousands, through shared myths. A Neanderthal could trust only those he personally knew. A sapiens could trust a stranger if they both believed in the same story, whether a tribal totem, a god, or later, a flag. This capacity for imagined communities was unprecedented in nature. Ants cooperate instinctively, wolves through pack bonds, but humans cooperate through fictions. This was the secret that allowed sapiens to spread, organize, and eventually dominate. Think for a moment about the implications. Without this revolution, there would be no religion, no law, no money, no governments. All of these rest on shared belief in things that do not physically exist. Gold has value only because people agree it does. A nation exists only because millions believe in it. A god has power only through faith. These intangible forces move. Armies build cities and inspire art, and they all began with a cognitive leap of 70,000 BCE. And yet, the revolution was not a single lightning bolt. It was a process unfolding over centuries and millennia, as groups experimented with new ways of thinking and living. Some innovations may have failed and vanished, lost to time. Others spread like wildfire, carried along migration routes and trade networks. We cannot point to a single moment when it began, but we can see the results. Within a few thousand years, sapiens had spread out of Africa, encountered other humans, and begun the long journey toward civilization. The phrase cognitive revolution might suggest something sudden, But in truth, it was both gradual and transformative. Imagine a small change in how language worked. The ability to tell stories, not just about what is here and now, but about what is not present, the past, the future, the spirits unseen. Imagine parents teaching children not just how to hunt, but why, weaving lessons into stories of ancestors or animals. Imagine groups gathering around the fire, not only to eat, but to tell tales, to sing, to dream together. Over time, these seemingly small changes rewired the very fabric of human society. In a sense, the revolution was less about intelligence and more about imagination. Neanderthals were intelligent, capable of planning hunts and making tools. But sapiens could imagine things that were not real and convince others to believe them too. This ability to share imagined realities is the foundation of culture. It is what allowed sapiens to leap from small, fragile bands to global dominance. So when we ask, what changed humanity forever? The answer lies here. Not in a spear or a fire, but in a story. The cognitive revolution gave us the power to weave fictions into reality, to turn myths into structures, to transform imagination into survival. It was a revolution not of weapons, but of words, not of muscles, but of minds. And it set Homo sapiens on a path that no other species has ever walked. If the cognitive revolution was the spark that transformed humanity, then language was the flame that carried it forward. Around 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens developed the most powerful tool evolution had ever produced, the ability to communicate not just with grunts, gestures, or simple calls, but with a rich, flexible, and symbolic system of language. This was not merely a way to share warnings or coordinate hunts. It was a way to share stories, pass down memory, build trust, and we've imagined worlds into reality. With language, the human mind escaped the boundaries of the individual and became a collective force. Before sapiens, many animals communicated. Monkeys can give alarm calls that distinguish between a snake and a leopard. Bees perform dances to tell their hive where nectar lies. Wolves howl to coordinate hunting packs. Even Neanderthals may have had a form of speech, their throats and hyoid bones, suggesting they were capable of vocalization. But sapiens went further. Our language was not limited to the present or the tangible. We could speak of what happened yesterday or what might happen tomorrow. We could describe things not present, the hunt in a distant valley, the spirit in the sky, the enemy camped beyond the ridge. Most importantly, we could create fictions, shared myths that existed only in imagination, yet shape behavior as powerfully as any physical reality. The birth of language was likely gradual. Early sapiens may have started with simple vocalizations tied to specific objects or actions. Water, meat, danger. Over generations, these sounds became more flexible, combining into phrases that conveyed relationships, water near trees, or meet after river. From there, the leap to grammar, the arrangement of words to express complex ideas, may have unfolded. Once grammar was in place, language exploded in power. With grammar, humans could tell stories. Yesterday, the herd moved across the valley, and tomorrow they will return. This ability to link past, present, and future in a narrative was revolutionary. It allowed planning, teaching, and cooperation on a scale no other animal could achieve. Imagine a hunting party before language. Coordination relied on gestures and instinct. A group could surround prey, but only with difficulty and only with simple strategies. Now, imagine a hunting party with language. The leader could describe the terrain, assign roles, warn of dangers, and even rehearse the hunt in words before it happened. The difference was not marginal. It was transformative. Success rates improved. Food supplies grew steadier, and survival became easier. Language turned hunting from chaos into choreography. But the true power of language went beyond survival. It allowed humans to create shared memory. Around a fire, one generation could tell the next about dangerous cliffs, hidden waterholes, or the habits of predators. Knowledge was no longer confined to personal experience. It became collective. A child could learn about a lion's behavior without ever having faced one, simply by hearing the stories of elders. This accumulation of wisdom across generations created what anthropologists call a cultural ratchet effect. Knowledge built up, layer upon layer, never slipping back to nothing. Each generation stood on the shoulders of the previous one, advancing further. Language also reshaped social life. In small bands, gossip became a crucial tool for building trust. With words, people could share who was generous and who was selfish, who could be trusted and who could not. This social chatter helped maintain cohesion in groups larger than the few dozen individuals that personal memory alone could manage. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar famously suggested that language evolved as a kind of vocal grooming, a way of maintaining bonds in groups too large for physical grooming to suffice. In this sense, gossip was not trivial. It was the glue of society. Most profoundly, language allowed the birth of myth. With words, humans could talk about things that were not real, but were believed collectively. The spirit of the river, the ancestor watching from the stars, the rules of the tribe. These shared fictions allowed strangers to cooperate to individuals from different bands could trust one another if they both believed in the same story. This was the foundation of religion, law, and eventually nationhood. No other species has achieved this, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack the medium of symbolic language. The archaeological record bears witness to the power of this transformation. After 70,000 BCE, symbolic artifacts multiply. Beads, carvings, cave paintings. These were not mere decorations. They were expressions of shared meaning. A bead was not just an ornament, but a signal of identity or belonging. A painting was not just art, but a story told in images. Language made such symbols possible, for it gave humans the ability to agree on what they meant. Without words, a red ochre mark is just a stain. With words, it becomes a symbol of life, death, or power. Some scientists debate whether Neanderthals had language, pointing to their anatomy and possible symbolic behavior. But even if they did, it was Sapiens who took it further, expanding vocabulary, grammar, and narrative to levels that transformed society. The survival of our species may have hinged less on physical strength or intelligence in the narrow sense, and more on this unparalleled ability to talk, to imagine, and to believe together. Consider, then, the immense legacy of this moment. Every poem, every law code, every constitution, every scientific theory, every love song, all flow from the birth of language. It was the bridge between the individual mind and the collective. It turned isolated thoughts into shared worlds. And it was the engine of the cognitive revolution, the force that carried humanity from fragile bands on the African savanna to global dominance. When we speak today, when we tell stories, argue, sing, or write, we are echoing the voices of those first sapiens who found new power in words. Their mouths, the world changed forever. With language, humanity began not only to survive, but to create and to dream. If language was the spark that ignited collective thought, then art and symbols were the first visible flames. Around 70,000 BCE, something remarkable appeared in the archaeological record. Objects that were not tools, weapons, or shelters, but creations of meaning. Beads, carvings, ochre-stained shells, painted caves. These were not necessary for survival in a narrow sense. You could hunt without them, cook without them, and live without them. And yet, they began to spread across human groups, becoming as essential to culture as fire or stone tools. They revealed something new about Homo sapiens. We were not only practical creatures, but imaginative ones, weaving worlds of symbols and beauty. The earliest evidence is humble but profound. In southern Africa's Blombos Cave, archaeologists discovered pieces of ochre engraved with crosshatch patterns dated to about 75,000 years ago. These geometric marks were deliberate, not accidental. They had no practical purpose. They were expressions of meaning. Nearby, pierced shells, likely strung as beads, suggest early forms of personal adornment. These were the beginnings of symbolic culture. Objects that said, "I belong," or "I believe," or "I am different." The beads carried stories about identity, status, or spirituality, stories that only made sense in the minds of those who shared them. From Africa, the symbolic explosion spread. In Europe, after sapiens arrived, caves became canvases. At Chauvet, Lascaux, and Altamira, walls came alive with paintings of bison, horses, lions, and mammoths. The artistry is breathtaking even today, with shading, perspective, and movement that suggests not crude doodling, but deliberate, practiced skill. These paintings were not mere decoration. Some scholars believe they were tied to rituals, perhaps hunting magic, where images were meant to influence the real animals outside. Others suggest they were part of storytelling traditions, ways of teaching younger generations about the creatures of the world. Whatever their purpose, they were acts of imagination, taking pigment, light, and stone, and turning them into visions of life. Symbols were not limited to animals. Figurines began to appear, carved from bone, ivory, or stone. The so-called Venus figurines, with exaggerated female forms, are among the most famous. Found across Europe and dating back as far as 40,000 years. They may have represented fertility, motherhood, or spiritual beliefs. Some interpret them as charms, others as expressions of shared mythologies. Their true meaning is lost to us, but their existence speaks volumes. For the first time, humans were creating representations of ideas, not just of what was seen, but of what was imagined. This symbolic world was powerful because it bound communities together. A bead necklace or a painted body could signal group identity, marking insiders and outsiders. A shared symbol on a cave wall could remind people of collective stories. Ritual objects could transform gatherings into sacred ceremonies. These symbols gave coherence to groups larger than family units, allowing trust and cooperation to extend further. They were the glue of early tribes, the forerunners of flags, crosses, crescents, and corporate logos. Art also allowed the birth of imagination as a cultural force. Before, imagination was private, confined to individual dreams or visions. With art and symbols, imagination became public. It could be shared, discussed, and built upon. A child could look at a cave painting and learn not only about the animal it depicted, but about the stories attached to it. A figurine could embody a belief that endured long after its creator's death. Symbols became carriers of memory. Imagination solidified into material form. It is worth pausing to reflect on what this meant for human psychology. Other animals dream, and some even make marks or sounds that might be expressive. But only sapiens made symbols that transcended immediate function. Only sapiens turned imagination into culture. This ability to project ideas into the world gave us a kind of immortality. A bead or carving could outlast its maker, carrying their thoughts across generations. In this sense, art was the first form of writing, the first archive of human meaning. There is also evidence that art and symbols played roles in spirituality. Burials with grave goods suggest beliefs in an afterlife. Cave paintings with hybrid creatures, half human, half animal, suggest myths of transformation, shamans, or spirits. The line between imagination and religion was blurred, for both relied on the same capacity to believe in what was not seen. Whether the first myths were of animals, ancestors, or cosmic forces, they marked a shift from survival to significance. Life was no longer just about finding food and avoiding predators. It was about meaning. The imaginative explosion also fueled innovation. A mind that could paint a bison on a wall could also imagine a better spear. A group that could agree on symbols could also cooperate in new ways. Creativity in art and creativity in survival were not separate. They were intertwined. The same mental flexibility that allowed humans to see a spirit in the sky allowed them to see new possibilities in the material world. The symbolic revolution was not just about beauty. It was about adaptability. By the time sapiens spread across the continents, art and symbols were everywhere. Each group had its own traditions, but the pattern was universal. Wherever humans went, they left behind traces of imagination, beads, carvings, paintings. This was not optional. It was fundamental. Symbols became as much a part of being human as tools or fire. They defined us, set us apart from our cousins, and laid the groundwork for everything from religion to science. In the end, art, symbols, and imagination were not luxuries of early humans. They were survival strategies. A shared myth could unite a tribe. A symbolic object could strengthen identity. A painting could teach, inspire, or console. These creations gave humans resilience in the face of uncertainty, courage in the face of danger, and connection in the face of isolation. They made life richer, but also more powerful. When we look at the painted walls of Chauvet or the carved beads of Blombos, we are not just seeing ancient art, we are seeing the birth of culture, the dawn of imagination, as a collective force. This was the moment when humanity began to live not only in the physical world, but in a world of meaning. And once imagination entered the human story, there was no turning back. By 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had already taken the first steps on a journey that would eventually encircle the globe. We often think of migration as something recent, tied to modern nations and borders. But for our ancestors, it was a matter of life and death. The story of humanity is in many ways the story of movement, following herds, chasing seasons, seeking new lands. What began as small wanderings out of Africa turned into the most dramatic expansion in the history of life. The spread of one species to every habitable continent on Earth. The cradle of sapiens was Africa. Diversity. For nearly 200,000 years, humans thrived in its grasslands, coasts, and forests. But Africa was not stable. Shifts in climate, driven by ice age cycles, brought periods of drought, famine, and scarcity. These pressures pushed groups to move first within Africa, then beyond. Archaeological evidence suggests that, as early as 120,000 years ago, small bands of humans had crossed into the Middle East, though these early ventures did not last. It was only around 70,000 years ago, coinciding with the cognitive revolution, that migration accelerated and became irreversible. The crossing point was likely the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow gap between Africa and Arabia at the southern end of the Red Sea. At times of low sea levels, this crossing was easier, perhaps only a few kilometers of water. With simple rafts or by hugging coastlines, humans could have made the leap. Once across, they entered the Arabian Peninsula, a harsh but navigable environment. From there, pathways opened, north into the Levant, east into Persia and India, further still into Southeast Asia, and eventually across to Australia. This expansion was not a march of armies, but a slow trickle of families and bands, moving over generations. Each step into new territory brought challenges, strange climates, unfamiliar animals, rival humans. Yet sapiens adapted with remarkable speed. In deserts, they learned to find water. In forests, to track game. On coasts, to fish and gather shellfish. Tools and fire came with them, but now bolstered by imagination, language, and symbols. Migration was not just survival, it was exploration. As sapiens spread, they encountered other human species. In the Levant, they met Neanderthals, who had occupied the region for hundreds of thousands of years. In Asia, they met Denisovans. These encounters were not simple. Sometimes they meant conflict, as groups competed for the same resources. Sometimes they meant intimacy, as genes were exchanged. The DNA of modern humans carries the legacy of these meetings, proof that migration was not just movement of bodies, but of bloodlines. The pace of expansion is astonishing when seen in hindsight. Within a few thousand years, sapiens had spread across South Asia, reaching as far as Indonesia. By 65,000 years ago, humans had crossed into Australia, a feat that required sea crossings of dozens of kilometers, a sign of remarkable ingenuity. By 45,000 years ago, they had moved into Europe, competing directly with Neanderthals. By 30,000 years ago, they had reached Siberia, and by at least 15,000 years ago, they had crossed into the Americas, either along a land bridge from Asia or by coastal routes. In less than 60,000 years, a blink in geological time, humans had spanned the planet. Why did sapiens succeed where others faltered? Part of the answer lies in flexibility. Neanderthals were superbly adapted to Europe's cold, but less versatile elsewhere. Denisovans thrived in Asia's mountains, but left little trace beyond. Sapiens, by contrast, adapted to everything: deserts, jungles, tundra, islands. Language, cooperation, and imagination allowed them to innovate quickly and share knowledge widely. A hunting technique developed in one region could spread through stories and teaching. Myths could carry lessons across generations. Migration was not just physical, it was cultural. This expansion also changed sapiens themselves. Selected for new traits. Darker or lighter skin tones adapted to different levels of sunlight. Genes from Neanderthals and Denisovans offered benefits like immunity to diseases or tolerance for high altitudes, shaping the human body as much as the human mind. The migration also transformed the world. Wherever sapiens went, extinctions followed. In Australia, giant marsupials vanished soon after humans arrived. In the Americas, mammoths, mastodons, and giant sloths disappeared within a few thousand years. Some argue this was due to overhunting, others to climate change. Likely it was both, but human presence was a critical factor. The global spread of sapiens marked the beginning of a new force on Earth, a species capable of reshaping entire ecosystems. And yet, for those first migrants, the story was not one of conquest, but of survival and discovery. Imagine the courage of crossing into an unknown land with no maps, no certainty of what lay ahead. Every valley could hold danger. Every forest, predators. The night sky was their only compass, the stories around the fire their only guide. And yet they walked, generation after generation, until they had filled the earth. In this sense, the Great Migration was the first great epic of humanity, not written in books, but etched in footsteps, carried in genes, and remembered in myths. It was the journey that made sapiens a global species, the turning point when humanity ceased to be local and became planetary. When we look around today at billions of people speaking thousands of languages on every continent, we are seeing The legacy of that ancient migration, 70,000 years ago. The world was vast and unknown, filled with dangers and mysteries. But for Homo sapiens, it was also filled with possibility. With imagination, language, and courage, they began to move, and they never stopped. As Homo sapiens spread across the continents after 70,000 BCE, they discovered something startling. They were not alone. The world was already inhabited by other human species, each adapted to its own landscapes, each with its own strengths and ways of life. The story of our expansion, then, was not only one of exploration and survival, but of encounters, meetings that would shape the destiny of our kind and theirs. These encounters were complex. They involved rivalry and cooperation, conflict and intimacy, violence and love. They left traces not only in the archaeological record, but in our very DNA. The first and most famous encounter was with the Neanderthals. These robust humans had lived in Europe and Western Asia for over 300,000 years before Sapiens arrived. They were stockier than us, with broad shoulders, powerful limbs, and large brains, in some cases even larger than those of Sapiens. Their societies were small but skilled, their toolkits sophisticated, and their survival strategies well adapted to Ice Age Europe. When Sapiens began entering their territory around 45,000 years ago, across the forests and plains of Eurasia, the relationship between Sapiens and Neanderthals has long been debated. For much of the 20th century, Neanderthals were seen as brutish and primitive, doomed to extinction by the superior intellect of Sapiens. Modern research has revised this picture. We now know that Neanderthals were intelligent, capable of making tools, burying their dead, and perhaps even creating symbolic art. Far from being clumsy, they were survivors of an unforgiving climate. Yet, despite their resilience, within 10,000 years of Sapiens arriving in Europe, Neanderthals were gone. How did this happen? The answer seems to be a mix of competition, conflict, and absorption. Where Sapiens and Neanderthals competed for the same game and resources, Sapiens may have held the edge due to more flexible strategies, broader diets, and more efficient cooperation. In direct conflict, Sapiens may have outnumbered them, using ranged weapons like throwing spears to reduce the risk of close combat. But the story was not simply war. Genetic evidence shows that Sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. Today, most people of European or Asian descent carry between 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. This is not the mark of annihilation alone, but of intimacy, encounters that ended not only in battles, but in unions. However fleeting, farther east, Sapiens met the mysterious Denisovans. Known from only a handful of bones and teeth found in Siberia's Denisova cave, they remain shadows in the fossil record. Yet their genetic legacy tells a deeper story. Modern populations in Asia, especially in Tibet and Melanesia, carry Denisovan DNA, including genes that help Tibetans survive in high-altitude environments with low oxygen. This suggests not only interbreeding, but the transfer of adaptive traits absorbed into the sapiens genome. Encounters with Denisovans were therefore not just biological, but evolutionary partnerships. shaping who we are today. There were likely other humans too, now lost to time. Fossils from Indonesia hint at the hobbits of Flores, small-statured humans who lived until about 50,000 years ago. Did sapiens meet them? Did they exchange tools? Or did the newcomers simply outcompete them? We do not know. What we do know is that by the time the Great Migrations were complete, all these other humans were gone. Only sapiens remained. Why did sapiens survive when others did not? Part of the answer lies in flexibility. Neanderthals were adapted to cold Europe, Denisovans to Asia, Flores hobbits to islands, but sapiens adapted everywhere. Our broader diets, social networks, and imaginative cultures gave us resilience. Another part lies in numbers. As sapiens spread, their populations grew, overwhelming smaller groups. And finally, part lies in culture. Shared myths and symbols enabled cooperation among strangers, creating larger, more cohesive societies than other humans could match. Yet, to see this only as victory is to miss the deeper truth. These encounters were not one-sided. We are not pure sapiens, but hybrids, carrying within us the echoes of those we met. Every Neanderthal tool, every Denisovan campfire, every lost tribe contributed in some way to our lineage. Was real, but their legacy endures. Our genes, in our memories, and in the shadows of our myths. They still walk with us. Imagine the moment of first contact. Two groups meeting in a valley, wary eyes studying the other. They look different, but not so different. More like distant cousins than aliens. Did they exchange words, gestures, or gifts? Did they fight immediately or circle each other cautiously? Did love ever cross the divide, binding to humans from different species in fleeting tenderness? These questions have no single answer, but they remind us that encounters were human in every sense. Messy, complex, tragic, and profound. The disappearance of the others was one of the great turning points in history. With their passing, sapiens became the sole human species inheriting the world. But this inheritance was not clean. It carried traces of those we replaced and absorbed. To this day, when a Tibetan breathes easily on a high mountain, or when geneticists trace the roots of our immune systems, we see the fingerprints of encounters long past. The Great Migration was thus not just a journey across landscapes, but a weaving together of humanity itself. Encounters with other humans defined us, tested us, and reshaped us. They were endings, but also beginnings. They gave us new genes, new ideas, and perhaps new stories. And they remind us of a sobering truth. Once we were many, now we are one. By the time Homo sapiens had spread across Africa, Asia, and Europe, the world was no longer a stage of many human players. One by one, our cousins, Neanderthals, Denisovans, the tiny hobbits of Flores, vanished from the scene. Only we remained. The question is one that has haunted scientists, historians, and storytellers alike. Why us? Why did sapiens survive while the others disappeared? The answer is not simple, and it likely lies in a mixture of biology, culture, environment, and chance. Yet, exploring the reasons sheds light on the very qualities that defined us, the traits that allowed our fragile species to endure when others, no less human, faded into extinction. Flexibility as a survival strategy. The first and perhaps most decisive factor was adaptability. Sapiens were not the strongest humans. Neanderthals had greater muscle mass and denser bones, making them formidable in close combat and superbly suited to Ice Age Europe. Denisovans thrived at high altitudes, carrying genetic adaptations that sapiens lacked. But sapiens had a different strength. We were generalists. Our diets were broader, our hunting strategies more varied, our habitats more flexible. A Neanderthal clan might depend heavily on large game like mammoths or bison, but if herds migrated or collapsed, starvation loomed. Sapiens, by contrast, could eat a wider range of foods: small animals, fish, nuts, berries, roots. We invented new tools like fishing hooks, traps, and nets, expanding our options. This flexibility meant that while others were tied to narrow ecological niches, sapiens could thrive almost anywhere, from African savannas to Arctic tundras. The power of cooperation. Another decisive factor was social organization. All humans cooperated in small groups, but sapiens pushed cooperation further. Thanks to language and shared myths, we could trust and collaborate with people beyond our immediate families. A Neanderthal might fight alongside 20 or 30 relatives. A sapiens could unite hundreds, even thousands, under a common story. This made us more resilient. Larger networks meant more knowledge was preserved, more resources shared, more allies in times of danger. When famine struck, information about distant food sources could be passed along through stories. When conflict arose, bands could unite under shared rituals or symbols. The result was a level of cohesion and scale that no other human species could match. Innovation and technologists' survival was also tied to innovation. Archaeological records show that after 70,000 BCE, sapiens' tools diversified rapidly. Blades became thinner and sharper, projectiles more effective, needles for sewing clothes more precise. Fire was mastered in new ways, used not only for warmth and cooking, but for reshaping landscapes, burning grasslands to attract game. For example, the true difference, however, was not in any single tool, but in the rate of innovation. Sapiens could invent, improve, and spread new ideas faster than others. A clever trick discovered in one group could be taught to another through language and storytelling. Knowledge accumulated like a snowball rolling downhill. Other humans made tools, but sapiens made progress. Encounters and competition. When sapiens met Neanderthals, Denisovans, or others, the results were rarely balanced. Competition for the same resources could tip in sapiens' favor, simply because we were more numerous, more cohesive, and more inventive. Even if encounters sometimes led to interbreeding, over time, sapiens expanded while the others dwindled. This does not necessarily mean direct extermination. There is little evidence of systematic warfare between sapiens and Neanderthals. For example, more likely, the competition was slow and relentless, in hunting grounds, in access to resources, in survival through harsh winters. Sapiens groups survived where others did not, and over millennia, the difference added up. Climate and chance. We must also acknowledge the role of climate and chance. The period between 70,000 and 30,000 years ago was one of dramatic environmental shifts. Ice sheets advanced and retreated. Habitats changed. Animals migrated or vanished. In such unstable conditions, species tied to specific niches, like the cold-adapted Neanderthals, were vulnerable. Sapiens, with their adaptability, had an edge, but survival was never guaranteed. A drought here, a famine there, a conflict at the wrong moment. These could have erased us too. That we survived may be as much luck as destiny. The cultural advantage, underlying all these factors, was one great advantage: culture, where other humans relied on instinct and learned behavior. Sapiens built a world of symbols, rituals, and shared stories. These gave us resilience, not just physically, but psychologically. A myth could inspire courage in the face of danger. A ritual could bind a group in solidarity. A symbol could carry meaning across generations. This cultural framework was not trivial. It made survival meaningful, turned hardship into shared experience, and gave direction to human life. While Neanderthals buried their dead, suggesting care and perhaps belief, Sapiens expanded this into elaborate rituals, myths of afterlife, and sacred traditions. Such beliefs may have strengthened social bonds, kept groups united, and helped individuals endure suffering. The legacy of survival by 30,000 years ago. The world's other human species had disappeared. The Neanderthals were gone. The Denisovans absorbed into Sapiens' gene pool. The Flores hobbits vanished. What remained was us, Homo sapiens, the last humans standing, yet their disappearance does not mean their story ended. DNA, Neanderthal, and Denisovan genes still whisper of ancient encounters. In our myths, echoes of old struggles and unions may linger. In our survival, their absence is as important as our presence. For their loss gave us the stage of history, the chance to become the species that reshaped the planet. It is tempting to see this as a triumph, a tale of superiority. It was circumstance, chance, and adaptability. Had the climate shifted differently, had sapiens stumbled where Neanderthals thrived, the world might have belonged to them instead. The survival of sapiens was not inevitable. It was fragile, contingent, and astonishing. When we ask, why did we survive? We are really asking, what does it mean to be human? The answer lies not only in our biology, but in our culture. Our imagination, our ability to believe in things that do not exist and to act on those beliefs together. These qualities saved us, and they continue to shape us today in the silence left by the vanished humans. Sapiens became the storytellers of the earth. Our survival was the beginning of their absence, and the beginning of everything that followed. Villages, cities, civilizations, nations, and the modern world. The stage was cleared, and Homo sapiens, alone now, began to write the next chapters of history. If the survival of sapiens was built on adaptability, language, and cooperation, then one of the deepest engines of that survival was spirituality, the invisible force that bound minds together through stories, symbols, and belief. Long before temples rose from stone or scriptures were written, humans already sensed that the world was filled with forces beyond the visible. Around 70,000 BCE, as imagination blossomed and culture expanded, the first seeds of spirituality began to take root. These seeds are hard to see in the archaeological record, but they are there, faint traces, like whispers from deep time. Burials with grave goods suggest belief in an afterlife. Figurines of animals and humans point to myths of fertility or power. Cave paintings with half-human, half-animal figures hint at shamans, spirits, and otherworldly beings. What these fragments show is that early sapiens were not satisfied with the material world alone. They sought meaning beyond survival, a framework that could explain life, death, and the mysteries in between. Death and the first rituals, one of the clearest windows into early spirituality, is the way sapiens treated the dead. Other human species, like Neanderthals, also buried their dead, sometimes with flowers or tools. But sapiens took this further. Graves became more elaborate, sometimes decorated with beads, ochre, or carvings. A young child buried with a necklace, a hunter with his spear, a woman with shells from the sea. These were not just practical deposits. They were signs of belief that the dead continued on some journey, that objects in this world could serve them in the next. Death rituals served both spiritual and social purposes. They gave comfort to the living, helping them cope with loss. By imagining continuity, they bound groups together in shared mourning and hope. And they created traditions that connected generations, linking the living to ancestors. Through burial, sapiens transformed death from an end into part of a story. Shamans and the spirit world another. Seed of spirituality was the rise of shamanism. The idea that certain individuals could move between the human world and the spirit world. Cave paintings from Europe and Asia depict hybrid creatures, humans with antlers, or figures that seem half animal, half man. These may represent shamans in trance, entering altered states of consciousness to commune with spirits or gods. Evidence suggests that early humans experimented with ritual dances, rhythmic music, and perhaps even hallucinogenic plants to reach such states. These moments, the boundaries between real and imagined blurred. A shaman might speak with ancestors, call upon animal spirits, or heal the sick with spiritual power. Whether these experiences were objectively real did not matter. What mattered was that they were shared, believed, and acted upon. Shamans gave meaning to suffering, guidance in uncertainty, and cohesion in crisis. They became keepers of myth, interpreters of dreams, and leaders in ritual. Their power came not from weapons, but from imagination and trust. Symbols and sacred objects alongside rituals. Symbols began to carry sacred weight. A carved figurine of a pregnant woman may have symbolized fertility. A painted bison may have been more than an animal. It may have embodied the spirit of the hunt. Red ochre, used in burials and art, may have symbolized blood, life, or rebirth. Such symbols worked because they condensed complex ideas into tangible forms. A bead could signify belonging to a tribe. A figurine could embody a myth. A painting could transform a cave into a sacred space. With symbols, humans could carry spirituality with them, embedding it into objects that survived long after rituals ended. The social power of belief spirituality was not just about mystery. It was about survival. Shared beliefs strengthened group identity. If a tribe believed that a river was sacred, they would protect it together. If they believed an ancestor watched over them, they would cooperate more readily. Belief created invisible bonds that made large-scale cooperation possible. Spiritual stories also provided rules and morals. A myth might warn against selfishness, dishonesty, or betrayal, framing them not as practical dangers, but as offenses against the sacred order. In this way, spirituality shaped behavior in powerful, lasting ways. The first gods, were there gods at this early stage? Perhaps not in the form we imagine today, but the seeds were there. The spirit of the hunt, the mother goddess, the sky father. These may have been among the earliest divine beings. Rather than distant gods ruling from above, these were forces woven into daily life. The animal that gave food, the storm that brought rain, the fire that gave warmth. Over time, as imagination expanded, these spirits grew into more complex pantheons. But the essence was the same. Humanity sought meaning in powers beyond themselves, and in doing so, found strength. Spirituality as a survival tool might be tempting to dismiss spirituality as illusion, a distraction from reality, but for early sapiens, it was deeply practical. Rituals eased fear. Beliefs fostered unity. Myths taught lessons. Even if the spirits were imagined, the effects were real. Courage, cooperation, hope. In the harsh world of the Ice Age, these could mean the difference between life and death. Spirituality also gave sapiens resilience in the face of uncertainty. Drought, famine, predators, disease, all were terrifying without explanation. Myths provided narratives that made suffering bearable. The storm was the anger of a god, the drought a trial to be endured. By framing hardship in stories, sapiens turned chaos into meaning. And with meaning came endurance. Legacy of the seeds. The seeds planted around 70,000 BCE would grow into forests of belief, religions, philosophies, rituals, temples, sacred texts. But their roots lay in those first burials, those first painted caves, those first dances around the fire. Spirituality was not an afterthought in human evolution. It was central, shaping how sapiens survived, thrived, and built societies. Even today, echoes remain. The way we honor the dead, the way we seek meaning in suffering, the way we tell stories larger than ourselves, all trace back to those early seeds. Spirituality, born in the deep past, continues to define us. Around 70,000 BCE, when sapiens first whispered prayers to unseen forces, the human story changed forever. We were no longer creatures simply surviving in nature. We were beings reaching beyond it, searching for the sacred, and in the process, finding the strength to endure. Among all the forces that shaped early humanity, few were as transformative as fire. It was more than a tool, more than a discovery. It was the heartbeat of human community. Around 70,000 BCE and earlier, humans had already mastered fire. But in this period, its role deepened. Fire became not just a source of warmth or protection, but a center of meaning, a gathering place, and a symbol of belonging. If imagination gave sapiens their inner world, fire gave them their outer one, illuminating the dark and drawing people together into something larger than themselves. Fire as survival. At the most basic level, fire was survival. It warded off predators that lurked at the edges of night. Lions, leopards, wolves, hyenas. It cooked food, transforming tough meat into tender meals, making roots and grains digestible, killing parasites and bacteria. It provided warmth against the bitter cold of Ice Age nights, especially in Europe and Asia, where winters were long and punishing. Without fire, sapiens could never have colonized such regions. But fire did more than protect the body. It expanded the possibilities of human life. Cooking freed energy, allowing humans to get more nutrition from the same food. This may have contributed to brain development, fueling the very cognitive abilities that distinguished sapiens from their cousins. In this way, fire was not only a tool of survival, but an engine of evolution. The hearth as community, yet the deeper impact of fire was social. Every evening, after the day's hunting and foraging, groups gathered around the flames. The hearth became the first human institution, a place of safety, storytelling, and sharing. In its glow, food was distributed, knowledge passed down, conflicts resolved. Fire created a physical center that mirrored the social center of the tribe. Around the fire, humans became more than scattered families. They became communities. The flickering light allowed faces to be seen, voices to be heard, emotions to be shared. It was in these moments that language found its rhythm. Myths were born, and trust was built. Fire turned darkness, once terrifying, into a space of connection. Fire and storytelling. The relationship between fire and storytelling is profound. Darkness limits sight, but fire expands imagination. Around the fire, humans told stories of the day's hunt, of ancestors, of spirits and gods. Shadows cast on. Cave walls may have inspired myths of creatures larger than life. The flames themselves, unpredictable and alive, may have seemed like spirits whispering from another world. These stories were not idle entertainment. They taught survival skills, encoded morals, and bound the tribe together with shared identity. A child listening to tales by the fire was learning how to live, how to hope, and how to belong. The hearth was not just a source of heat. It was a classroom, a theater, a temple. Fire as a symbol as humans imagined more. Fire took on symbolic power. It became a marker of sacredness, a sign of life, a metaphor for the spirit. In many later cultures, fire was linked to gods. The Greeks imagined Prometheus stealing it from heaven. Hindus preserved it as a sacred element in ritual. and Zoroastrians enshrined it in their temples. These myths may have roots in the deep past, when fire first became more than flame, carrying fire on journeys, preserving embers through the night, protecting it from rain and wind. These acts were not just practical, but ritualistic. Fire demanded care and attention, and in return, it gave light, warmth, and life. It was a relationship of dependence that humans invested with meaning. Fire and cooperation. The management of fire also demanded cooperation. Someone had to tend it through the night. Someone had to gather fuel. Someone had to pass it on when groups traveled. In this sense, fire was a communal resource, owned by no one, but shared by all. The responsibility of fire reinforced the responsibility of community. This collective aspect gave fire a unique place in human life. It was not like a personal tool or weapon. It belonged to the group, a shared treasure. Sitting together around the same flame, humans felt their unity made visible. The hearth was the first public space in human history. Expanding horizons with fire also expanded human horizons. With torches, caves could be explored, creating the first subterranean sanctuaries of art and ritual. With controlled burns, landscapes could be reshaped, grasslands cleared, game driven, habitats transformed. This fire farming gave sapiens a new level of control over their environment, a step toward the agriculture that would come millennia later. Perhaps most strikingly, fire extended the day. With light at night, humans gained extra hours for work, play, and reflection. This may seem small, but it had enormous consequences. More time around the fire meant more conversation, more planning, more creativity. Night, once a time of fear and silence, became a time of invention and imagination. Fire and identity. By 70,000 BCE, fire was no longer just a tool. It was woven into human identity. To be sapiens was to live with fire. Groups without it were at a disadvantage, vulnerable and cold. Groups with it thrived, expanded, and carried it with them into new lands. The mastery of fire was a universal marker of humanity, a common thread linking tribes across continents. Even today, echoes remain. We still gather around fires, in hearths, in campfires, in festivals. We still tell stories in their glow, still find comfort in their warmth, still see in them a symbol of life. Fire is no longer essential for survival in the way it was, but it remains essential to our imagination, a reminder of the nights when it first drew us together. Legacy of the hearth. The hearth gave humanity more than survival. It gave us society. It was the first architecture, the first circle of belonging, the first ritual space. It shaped our days and our nights, our meals and our myths, our communities and our symbols. Without fire, there would have been no great migration, no expansion into cold lands, no flourishing of imagination. When we imagine early sapiens, huddled around flames as darkness pressed close, we are looking at the crucible of humanity. The hearth was the stage on which language, cooperation, and spirituality all deepened. It was where we became who we are. Fire did not just change our environment, it changed us. It gave us warmth, but also wisdom, safety, but also story. light, but also life. The hearth was the first home of humanity, and it still burns in us today. When we look back across the long, winding road of human history, one era stands out with a brilliance that cannot be ignored. Around 70,000 BCE. Before this time, Homo sapiens were clever animals, equipped with tools and fire, capable of survival and cooperation. After it, they were something more, beings of imagination, myth, language, and art, creatures who could reshape not only their environment, but also themselves. This was the turning point that changed humanity forever. A world transformed by mind. At the heart of the revolution was not muscle or bone, but mind. The changes that unfolded after 70,000 BCE were subtle yet sweeping. With new cognitive powers, humans began to paint in caves, carve symbols, weave myths, trade goods, and spread across continents. What distinguished sapiens from every other creature was no longer just physical survival, but conceptual survival. The ability to live in worlds of meaning. The handprint on a cave wall was no longer just pigment. It was identity, memory, and claim. The bead strung on a cord was not only decoration, but a message of belonging. The story told around the fire was not merely entertainment, but the glue of social order. Humanity had crossed a threshold into symbolic existence. The new social order, the turning point, also reshaped social life. No longer limited to bands of 30 or 50, humans could now unite in tribes of hundreds or even thousands. Myths, rituals, and shared stories allowed strangers to trust one another, forming bonds of belief. Through these bonds came cooperation on unprecedented scales, larger hunts, shared rituals, coordinated migrations. With language and gossip, trust was extended and reinforced. With trade and exchange, alliances could form. With art and myth, identities could expand beyond kinship. Each of these developments built upon the others, weaving a social fabric more complex than any in the natural world. The expanding world, the legacy of the 70,000 BCE revolution was not confined to ideas. It reshaped the physical world. Humans spread out of Africa into Asia, Europe, and eventually Australia and the Americas. Along the way, they encountered new landscapes, new challenges, and new possibilities. The imagination that painted animals on cave walls also allowed humans to imagine crossing rivers, deserts, and seas. This expansion came at a cost. Other hominin species, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, faded into extinction. Whether by competition, interbreeding, or violence, sapiens emerged as the last humans standing. The turning point was not only the dawn of our species' rise, but also the twilight of others. The double-edged gifted. It is important to remember that the revolution of 70,000 BCE was a double-edged gift. Myths united, but they also divided. Language communicated truth, but also deception. Trade created bonds, but also competition. The same imagination that created art and ritual could also create fear, prejudice, and war. From the very beginning, the powers that defined humanity carried both creation and destruction. This duality is still with us today. The stories that inspire nations can also incite conflict. The technologies that connect us can also isolate us. The imagination that paints visions of peace can also forge weapons of unimaginable power. The legacy of 70,000 BCE is not only our strength, but also our burden. From sparks to civilizations, the small sparks of imagination in 70,000 BCE grew into the fires of civilization. Myths became religions. Trade networks became economies. Art became culture. Language became literature, law, and science. The seeds planted in the deep past blossomed into cities, empires, and nations. When we walk into a museum, read a book, or participate in a ritual, we are heirs of that turning point. The cave paintings of Chauvet and the tablets of Mesopotamia belong to the same lineage. Both are attempts to preserve meaning across time, to speak the language of eternity. What really changed humanity forever? So what was it that truly changed humanity forever at 70,000 BCE? It was not a single invention, but a constellation. The capacity for abstract thought, for shared myths, for language, for symbolic art, for networks of trust and trade. Above all, it was the ability to imagine and to make imagination real through cooperation. This was the birth of culture, the moment when Homo sapiens ceased to be just another animal and became history makers. From this moment on, our destiny would not be shaped only by nature, but by our own minds. Toward the horizon of 70,000 BCE stretches forward into our present and beyond. We are still living in the shadow and the light of that revolution. Every religion, every nation, every economic system, every work of art is an echo of the first myths, the first exchanges, the first words spoken in feral IGHT, the great question we face today is the same one our ancestors faced then. What stories will we choose to tell? The myths of the past gave us identity and cooperation, but also division and violence. The myths of the future will determine whether humanity survives its own power. In that sense, the legacy of 70,000 BCE is unfinished. It is not only history, but also responsibility. The imagination that lifted us from small bands to global civilization now demands wisdom. For just as stories once bound 30 hunters into a tribe, today they must bind billions into a species capable of surviving together. Conclusion: the turning point. That never ends. The turning point at 70,000 BCE was not a single moment, but the beginning of a new trajectory, a horizon that humanity is still walking toward. We are the descendants of storytellers, painters, traders, and believers. Their gifts still shape us. Our world, crowded, connected, creative, and conflicted. We are seeing the ripples of that ancient revolution. It was the birth of what we call humanity. Fragile, flawed, but endlessly inventive. And as long as we continue to tell stories, paint visions, exchange ideas, and believe in something greater than ourselves, the revolution of 70,000 BCE is not over. It lives on in us. It is us.